My name is Evan Leibovich. I'm president of the Internet Society Canada chapter. I'm here with Andrew Clement, who's a professor at U of T who specializes in a field that's very important to the issue of Internet policy, specifically on the issue of keeping Internet packets that are going from Canadian addresses to other Canadian addresses and keeping them in Canada. Andrew, why is this an issue, and why should people be concerned about the way things are?
I think that's an important issue that hasn't got nearly as much attention as it should. First, in the area that I'm interested in is the question of surveillance, and particularly since the Snowden revelations about the NSA, we've had confirmed in many ways our worst fears that the National Security Agency is intercepting our traffic, our internet traffic, when it passes through the major gateways in the United States, where copies are made, analyzed, and so on. So I've been looking at this for a number of years, trying to show people where their data passes through those sites. So that's the first issue, is just the privacy issues, the threat from mass state surveillance, which we're now becoming much more aware of.
Is the issue, though, in Canada between, say, packets going from one ISP to another? So if packets are going from Bell to Rogers, they route through elsewhere outside of Canada. Is it an issue between the ISPs, or is it bigger than that? Is it different from that?
Well, you would think in Canada that, for long haul, like from Vancouver to Halifax, it might go through the U.S. just because there's more capacity and so on. That's a long history in Canada of that. But what really struck us in our research was that a significant amount of the traffic that starts in one city and ends in the same city, in this case Toronto, actually also goes by the U.S. So it's not about distance, it's not about the geography of Canada, it's about the relationships, as you say, between the various ISPs and whether they hand off traffic to each other locally, or whether they play some game where they don't want to, let their smaller competitors get an advantage by working with them. So they force their traffic basically to be exchanged in the U.S. And so this is a matter of ISP policy. It's not a matter of technical efficiencies. And we see a strong pattern of this.
So is there a role that can be played either by government or regulatory agencies, or is it a business issue? Is it something that can be done through regulation? Is it something that should be done through encouraging a certain business practice? Or how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think both of those sort of policy means should be, and I think can be effective. We should be, under privacy law, expecting that the data that's kept that started in Canada to be kept here, because our privacy laws say that that's important. Our data does not get anywhere near the same protection as it does. It does not get as much protection in the U.S. as it does in Canada for some obvious reasons, but they often get ignored. So yes, there should be a sort of greater regulation about the trans-border flow of our personal information, and that can be done through strengthening laws, through strengthening the enforcement of our laws, also through the procurement policy. So I'm at the University of Toronto. Traffic between here and the Student Assistance Program, which is another provincial agency, which is across the street almost, that goes via the U.S. And so why can't our provincial agencies, when they procure internet services, insist that the exchange is being done in Canada? And it's very easy to do because we have, not far from here, the largest internet exchange point in Canada at 151 Front Street. And it would be cheaper and faster for that traffic to be exchanged right there. And I think we also need our carriers to be much more upfront about their policies. These agreements between the carriers, our ISPs, about exchanges with others are basically secret. But they're important pieces of information if our infrastructure that we rely on, the internet, is shrouded in this kind of mystery. So we're also working to promote a transparency among the ISPs, so that at least we can tell what they're doing, and also bring some accountability, so that if they're forcing traffic into the U.S., we should at least know that. And the research site that where we've made some videos about showing this kind of sort of boomerang traffic, as we call it, where it goes back to to the U.S. before coming to Canada, and also about our transparency report. Can be found there. The project is called the Internet Exchange Mapping Project, or IXMAPS for short, IXMAPS.ca, and you can see videos there that show in sort of animated version using Google Earth, your packets flying around and going through these cities and so on. And also you can see our transparency report there. We call that which ISPs are keeping you in the know or in the dark.
Well, one question that comes out of this, everything you're saying makes perfect sense. It almost begs the question then of what is the case against doing this? Why is there resistance to keeping packets in Canada? Why is there, what is the benefit to anyone of having stuff going from one city to the other, to the same place, to the same city, and routing that through another country? What's the case for that?
Well, the carriers, as I understand, say that they've got more capacity down in the U.S., and so it's actually cheaper for them. I'm not quite convinced about that. What I think they're doing, and there's I think a lot of evidence for that, is the carriers are playing competitive games, that they want to run the industry as a kind of an oligopoly. So they don't want to keep smaller competitors or allow them in. So they make it harder to do that. And we see that in other areas with telecommunications about, can a competitor put wires up on a pole? We can see those poles, we can see those wires, but still, there's a lot of games being played about this. The internet is invisible. We can't see those arrangements. We can't see where the routing goes. We can't see where the fiber is buried. But they're taking advantage of that invisibility to play similar kinds of games, which the CRTC is not yet onto, and so they're I think basically acting like oligopolists, and that's why it's to their advantage to keep the smaller ones out, and they don't care so much about whether that means that our traffic has to go to the U.S. or not. That's secondary. The other reason I think that why they get away from that is because we're in a sort of policy regime where it's called light regulation. So the government has a sort of hands-off approach, and that only when things go really bad does the government step in and make laws and regulation. And this is a significant shift from decades ago, when there was much more of a public interest argument that was made about how telecommunications was conducted, that they had to actually show that things were in the public interest. There is now no longer a effective public interest test to see how determine how these carriers work.
But is the issue then, as you say, that the government doesn't necessarily see that this is a significant problem?
Yeah.
Even sort of in post 9/11, everyone looking at everyone else, you would think that they might be aware that this is a heightened issue.
Well, you say it's a heightened issue. The argument that this is going to make us safer, the argument that if we need to track everybody so that we can find, the few bad apples, I mean, that is a more compelling one so far than the one that, well, we really need to be much more privacy protected. Now, with Snowden's revelations, we've now started the debate where we're saying, well, wait a minute, are these security measures effective? And, a lot of evidence suggests that they're not. That the surveillance of everyday life is, feeds a kind of a thirst for data, but doesn't show evidence that it's actually effective, and that it's perhaps being used more for social control. That's the advantage of having that they can get our data and use it in multiple ways, not about anti-terrorism, but much more prosaic uses, but that these are questionable in terms of our laws and our constitution. And I think now is the time when we need to shine a much brighter light on these practices of where our data is going, who's looking at it, for what purposes, what kind of controls do we have, and what sort of responsibilities do those who have our data, like the ISPs, like our public institutions, what's their responsibility to protect that? And so what we're trying to do in this project, this research project, the xmaps.ca project, is to render that kind of surveillance much more visible so that people can see what's going on, make their own decisions, and hold those whose data, who has our data, much more accountable for what they're doing with it.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks
Okay.
very much.